I was honestly stunned that not one, but two attorneys were okay with me sitting on the jury. If I were in their shoes, I'd never let a lawyer be part of the jury. I even told the other jurors as much when they reasonably suggested I step up as the foreman. There's a good reason lawyers don't belong on juries, I explained. When legal questions or procedural matters come up, people naturally lean on the lawyer's perspective. It's easy for their opinions to carry extra weight. And if the lawyer ends up being the foreman, well, then you run the risk of them overshadowing everyone else. Instead of a group effort with 12 different viewpoints, you could end up with just one dominant voice. I'd rather stick to the background and contribute like the rest of you. Come on, Robert. Do you really think we're such pushovers that we just go along with whatever you say? Chimed in Laura Reynolds. She was 38, a teacher and stay-at-home mom with 2 young daughters. We all have our own lives and make our own decisions. Nobody here is going to let someone steamroll them. That's not what I meant, I clarified quickly. I wouldn't want a doctor on my jury if we were deciding a medical case either. They'd know things the rest of us wouldn't, and people might assume their interpretation is automatically correct, certainly more accurate than their own. It's not about doubting anyone's strength of character. I have complete faith in this jury. That's exactly why I don't want to risk compromising our collective judgment in any way. Thankfully, I seemed to smooth over their concerns about my motives. In the end, we decided Frank DeMaio would make the best foreman. Frank was a pharmacist, and while I'd probably hesitate to have him on a jury for a case involving pharmaceuticals, this was an attempted murder trial. As far as I could tell, he didn't have any personal stakes in the subject. This arrangement was perfect for me. It gave me a rare opportunity to observe firsthand how juries process evidence and reach their verdicts. Insights I hope to use in my own legal work someday. I silently thanked those 2 lawyers for their lapse in judgment. Their decision to keep me on wasn't necessarily a brilliant move on their part, but it certainly aligned with my goals. That was how I felt when we first sat down to deliberate. Little did I know, what lay ahead was a series of surprising moments that would teach me more than I ever imagined. The first twist came when the jury started evaluating the attorney's performance. Going into deliberations, I thought both lawyers had done a decent, workmanlike job. Apparently, I was in the minority. In fact, including myself, only one juror held that opinion. The prosecutor, Eric Bishop, had presented the victim, David Crowley, as his star witness, bringing him to the stand to recount the day he nearly lost his life. "Mr. Crowley," Bishop began, "can you walk us through what happened that afternoon?" Crowley leaned in, speaking with a straightforward, almost casual demeanor. "Well, I'll be the first to admit I ain't no saint. I was with Natalie in her bed. We were, being intimate, if you catch my drift. I was on top. Didn't hear anyone come in, so I figured we had the place to ourselves. Then all of a sudden, there's this loud bang, and splinters of wood are flying off the bedpost. I sat up, spun around, and there's her husband, Jeff, standing there with this huge, no, scratch that, this monstrous gun in his hands. That got my attention real quick. He says, 'You've been chasing after my wife and other men's wives for too long. Now you've finally met a husband who won't stand for it.' Then he raises the gun, points it at me, and pulls the trigger. He hit me dead center in the chest, but somehow the bullet didn't go in. And you know what he says after that? All smug-like, he sneers, 'You're a lucky man, a misfire. Think lightning could strike twice.' Well, after seeing the kind of damage that first bullet did to the bedpost, I sure as hell wasn't about to stick around and see if the next one worked. I shot up like a rocket and bolted, didn't even bother with my clothes. I just tore down the stairs as fast as I could. Jeff was yelling something behind me, but I wasn't sticking around to make out the words. I grabbed my keys off the little table by the front door, sprinted out to my car, buck naked, and peeled out of there like the devil himself was chasing me. Later on, I talked to Natalie," David continued, settling back into his seat. "She told me Jeff said I'd better not show my face around there again unless I wanted to find out just how serious he was. Now, I'm sitting there thinking, hold on a second. That right there is hearsay. He's repeating something that allegedly got said outside the courtroom to prove Jeff made a threat. How's that sliding by without objection? Is Jeff's lawyer even awake over there? David kept on talking, filling in more details and some background, while Jeff's attorney finally seemed to snap out of whatever trance he was in. So, you said you were engaged in relations with Mrs. Granger, he began, cocking his head slightly. Tell me, were you trying to marry into the family too? The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. Objection, he cut in. Counsel's not asking a question. He's just trying to insult the witness. Jeff's lawyer, Blake, and no, I'm not making that name up, flashed a smug grin. I'm simply exploring his, let's say, predatory tendencies, Your Honor. At this point, the judge had enough. He started hammering his gavel, trying to get things under control, but neither lawyer seemed too interested in playing by the rules. It felt less like a trial and more like two boxers circling each other in a grudge match. Blake decided to dial up the theatrics. He threw his arm out dramatically and compared the prosecutor, Eric Bishop, to the old Soviet secret police. He's trying to throw a man in jail for the crime of defending his marriage, Blake declared, eyes gleaming. Eric, who for some reason insisted on going by Steve to sound more approachable, wasn't about to let that slide. Blake, he fired back. We'll say whatever it takes to put a violent, gun-wielding maniac back in your neighborhood. That's when the shouting kicked in. The whole courtroom felt like it was spiraling out of control until the judge roared over the commotion. In my head, I'd already started calling him Judge Clark because, honestly, this whole circus felt more like a variety show in some tiny town square. If you two don't cool it, he warned, you'll both be in a cell before the defendant. I had to admit it was a funny line, but it also left me wondering if the judge realized the implications of what he just said. Jeff was out on bail. Was the judge accidentally suggesting we should find him guilty before the trial had even wrapped up? When things settled down, Blake shifted gears. Mr. Crowley, he asked, pacing a little in front of the stand. How many husbands have actually tolerated your little visits with their wives? Before David could answer, Steve jumped in with another objection, rattling off why the question was irrelevant. But the judge cut him off with a stern warning to Blake. You're skating on thin ice, he said, narrowing his eyes. Blake barely acknowledged the caution. Isn't it true, he pressed on, that you have a habit of pursuing married women behind their husbands' backs? Steve shot up again. Objection, irrelevant, immaterial, and beyond the scope of direct evidence. Blake didn't flinch. Your Honor, he said smoothly, I'm questioning the witness about acts that involve lying, sneaking, and deception. If he's willing to cover things up in one part of his life, it speaks directly to his credibility on the stand. I had to hand it to Blake. That argument made a lot of sense to me. I caught myself wondering if Judge Clark started his morning with oatmeal or something more substantial. Overruled, the judge said, clearly unimpressed, but I still imagined it was something healthy. Blake jumped at the opportunity, grilling David about 3 other married women he'd supposedly been involved with before the judge finally stepped in. All right, we get the picture, he snapped. Move along. Blake shifted strategies, now asking David if he'd ever considered the damage he left in his wake, the homes he'd wrecked and the families torn apart. Steve objected again, but Blake steamrolled right past him, pushing David about the kids affected by his affairs. Steve didn't hold back. Your Honor, opposing counsel is showing blatant disrespect for the court. But Blake had his comeback ready. And the prosecution, he said with a dramatic pause, would rather defend gutter trash than stand up for decent, law-abiding citizens. And just like that, we were right back to square one. 2 lawyers barking at each other like dogs fighting over the last scrap. Not to be outdone, Steve shot back with a smirk, saying Blake would gladly represent any lowlife with enough cash to pay his fee. Finally, Judge Clark, slow to catch on but eventually getting there, pounded his gavel and gave both attorneys a stern look. Gentlemen, you make your objections to me, he reminded them, his voice sharp, and I'll rule on them. From where I was sitting, it seemed like Blake had landed a few solid punches about David's character, and Steve was starting to lose his edge. But later, when we gathered in the jury room, I realized I'd completely missed the bigger picture. That Blake man is just awful, Mrs. Friedman said, practically spitting the words out. I wouldn't trust anyone who hired a lawyer like him. She wasn't alone. Several others nodded in agreement, clearly sharing her distaste. It hit me then. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped focusing on the defendant and started judging his attorney instead. The more obnoxious Blake became, the less benefit of the doubt we were willing to extend to Jeff Granger. Not because of the evidence, mind you, but simply because we couldn't stand his representation. That other lawyer wasn't much better, Mr. Chavez chimed in, leaning back in his chair. But I almost felt sorry for him. At least he's just trying to do his job. Blake's got him so wound up I'm surprised he hasn't popped. That one caught me off guard. I'd always assumed juries expected lawyers to be aggressive, that we were supposed to come out swinging. This wasn't some British courtroom where decorum and pleasantries were the norm. In our system, we're practically trained to go for the jugular. But maybe we'd crossed some invisible line where adversarial had started to mean downright nasty. Lesson 1. Juries like lawyers who play nice. And if they like the lawyer, they're more inclined to like the client. Sarcasm and snarky remarks might feel satisfying in the moment, but they don't win any favors with the folks deciding the verdict. It was a humbling realization. I could already see I'd need to rethink how I approach things in my own practice. Next, Natalie took the stand. Blake made a half-hearted objection, citing marital privilege, but Judge Clark shut it down almost immediately. Marital privilege doesn't cover things said in front of a third party you're shooting at, he ruled dryly. I had a chuckle at that one. Personally, I didn't think marital privilege applied in front of any third party, shooting or not, but the judge wasn't in the mood for hypotheticals. Natalie backed up David's story, confirming that Jeff had threatened him. But then she added another layer to it. Apparently, Jeff had thrown some words her way too. Fool me once, shame on you, she recounted, her voice steady. Fool me twice. Well, who knows what happens when an angry man's got a gun? I had to admit, Jeff Granger had a certain poetic flair. Steve's next witness was a firearms expert who testified that the bullet which hit David, but somehow didn't go through him had, without question, come from Jeff's gun. Curiously, Steve didn't dig into the oddity of that fact. But Blake? Oh, Blake pounced on it during cross-examination. The expert admitted that while a bullet failing to penetrate at close range was rare, blatantly rare if you ask me, it wasn't unheard of. Known to happen, he said with a shrug. I glanced around the jury box, wondering if anyone else caught what I did. Phrases like known to happen or is it possible, followed by a half-hearted yes, were just lawyer speak for I seriously doubt it. But we throw them around like they carry the weight of scientific discovery. The expert also confirmed that a shot from a .38 revolver at such close quarters is typically fatal. Steve seemed content with that and rested his case. Blake's turn. He called Jeff Granger to the stand, and things took an unexpected turn almost immediately. Mr. Granger, did you shoot David Crowley as he described? Blake asked, his tone casual. Steve was practically grinning ear to ear, like the trial was already in the bag. Jeff met Blake's gaze and nodded calmly. Kind of, he replied. I shot him. The bullet hit him, but it didn't go through. Steve's smile twitched, flickering into something closer to confusion. Did you intend to shoot him like that? Blake pressed. Yes, I did. Was it your intention to cause harm? Certainly not. Steve's smirk had officially vanished. Can you explain, Blake continued, how exactly you managed to hit him without hurting him? Jeff leaned forward slightly, and the whole courtroom seemed to hold its breath. I used .38 special ammunition, he began, but I modified the cartridges, took the bullets out, emptied the powder, and replaced the primer. Then I put a little bit of the powder back and sealed them up again. Tested different amounts until I found just enough to make sure the bullet would leave the barrel but wouldn't penetrate anything important. I even tested it on materials that mimic skin, ribs, and muscle. I could practically hear the gears turning in everyone's heads. Jeff leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. I attached thin pork chops to a wooden frame and started experimenting with different loads, he explained, as if this was the most normal hobby in the world. Once I figured out the right amount of powder, I loaded a few cartridges and tested them with my Smith & Wesson .357 by shooting at a squirrel. He paused, letting that sink in. My goal, he continued, was to make sure the bullet wouldn't go all the way through. I hit the squirrel, it let out a squeal and took off running. When I checked the spot where it had been, the bullet was lying there, fully intact. Not a single drop of blood. That's when I knew I had the load right. Jeff glanced around the room, eyes calm, as if he hadn't just casually admitted to squirrel ballistics testing. I used the .357 with the 5-inch barrel, he added. Gave me better accuracy. I didn't want to risk hitting the wrong spot. The courtroom was dead silent by the time Jeff finished, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Jurors, spectators, hell, even the judge, sat there wide-eyed. His calm, almost surgical explanation had left everyone stunned. The day I shot him, Jeff went on, I used a regular, unmodified shell for the first shot, the one that hit the bedpost. I wanted them to believe I was using deadly rounds. The second shot, that was just to scare him off. I never fired a third shot, though even if I had, it wouldn't have gone through him. Jeff paused, letting his gaze drift over the jury box. The little comment I made after, that was just to make sure he believed if he came after my wife again, I'd put him in the ground. Blake, standing with one hand in his pocket, let the silence stretch before stepping forward. You mentioned using a Smith & Wesson .357, he said, but you also talked about .38 ammunition. Can you clarify that for us? Jeff nodded without missing a beat. The .357 revolver is designed to fire both .357 and .38 ammo. Same gun, different rounds. Blake kept his tone light but nudged a little deeper. You went to a lot of trouble to scare him, he noted. How did you know he'd be there at that particular time? Jeff's eyes narrowed, and his voice sharpened. The idiot was bragging about it, he replied. Kept running his mouth about nailing my wife. His words, not mine. Even had the nerve to say when he planned to do it again. A bartender overheard and passed it along to me. Apparently, he thought it was funny. Jeff's lip curled slightly. I do a lot of target shooting. I know how to modify my ammo, so I planned it out. I wanted to scare him off, and scare my wife too. I needed her to believe that if she cheated again, with him or anyone else, I wouldn't hold back. His eyes flicked toward Natalie, but she wouldn't meet his gaze. Jeff exhaled, leaning back in the witness stand. But now that I'm being prosecuted, I guess everyone knows I'm a pushover. Looks like I'll just have to settle for a divorce. Blake glanced at the judge, signaling he was finished. I thought he might press a little harder, but he let Jeff's words speak for themselves. As far-fetched as the story sounded, there was something oddly convincing about it, like it was just strange enough to be true. Then it was Steve's turn. He strolled up, smoothing out his tie, and wasted no time adopting that classic prosecutorial tone, the one dripping with condescension. Mr. Granger, Steve said, practically rolling his eyes. Are we really supposed to believe that you shot David Crowley at point-blank range, but somehow had no intention of hurting him? I shifted in my seat. Steve was walking a fine line. That tone, sarcastic, almost mocking, felt like a mistake. All Jeff had to do was say yes, and Steve's whole line of questioning would unravel. But Blake had clearly prepped Jeff for this moment. Certainly, Jeff replied smoothly. And if you don't believe me, bring the gun in and shoot me with it. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A couple of jurors exchanged glances, and even the bailiff smirked. Judge Clark hammered his gavel so hard I thought it might crack in half. Steve, to his credit, bounced back quicker than I expected. That's easy for you to say, Mr. Granger, he fired back. Knowing full well the judge wouldn't allow such a demonstration, Jeff tilted his head, the hint of a smirk curling his lips. Is that a question, Mr. Bishop? Or have I completely forgotten how the English language works? Are you testifying now? Or was there some actual evidence you wanted to bring forward? Steve's earlier condescension now looked downright friendly next to Jeff's cutting sarcasm. Steve tried to regain his footing, arguing that Jeff was mocking him, which, to be fair, he was, but Blake jumped in before Steve could finish. accusing him of overstepping, which honestly he was. Meanwhile, Judge Clark tried and failed to referee the escalating shouting match. His gavel might as well have been a drumstick at a rock concert for all the good it did. Eventually, after several loud cracks of wood against the bench, the shouting subsided. Clark leveled a stern glare at both attorneys. They mumbled something that vaguely resembled an apology, but neither one looked particularly repentant. It felt like watching two actors half-heartedly playing out a courtroom drama. To be fair, it was entertaining, but Steve wasn't done. I caught that glint in his eye, the one lawyers get when they think they're about to deliver the knockout punch. I'd seen it plenty of times. The problem is that look often comes right before the dumbest question of the entire trial. And this was no exception. "You fired at his chest," Steve pressed, his tone sharpening. "But couldn't you just as easily have hit his throat? Or somewhere else that might have killed him?" Jeff didn't even blink. He leaned forward slightly, smirking as he answered. "At that range," he said, "I could have circumcised the prick." A wave of stifled laughter rippled through the courtroom before Judge Clark's gavel brought it to a halt. "That's enough," the judge growled, though I noticed the faintest puff of air escape his lips. If he hadn't caught himself, I swear he might have snorted. Had he been mid-sip of coffee, half the courtroom, including the first two rows, would have been wearing it. With the excitement settling, we moved through the remaining witnesses, though there weren't many left to hear. Soon enough, I found myself back in the jury room, ready to politely decline any suggestions that I take on the role of foreman. Mrs. Friedman wasted no time steering the group toward our first unanimous agreement. Blake is absolutely unbearable," she declared, crossing her arms. "Steve Bishop isn't exactly likable, but at least he's tolerable by comparison." I had to agree. Blake was hard to stomach, while Steve, despite his arrogance, still felt like the lesser evil. "It's just tough to take Blake seriously," Mrs. Friedman went on. "I mean, wouldn't he be willing to twist anything, true or not, if it helped his case?" Laura Reynolds, sitting a few chairs down, nodded slowly. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. "Neither had I, to be honest. It wasn't the angle I expected anyone to take. We were supposed to be sifting through facts, yet here we were dissecting the defense attorney's character as if that held the key to Jeff's fate." Before I could figure out how to steer the conversation back toward the evidence, Mike Robinson spoke up, shaking his head. "I think he had it coming," Mike said bluntly. "Hell, even if that bullet hadn't misfired, I'd say he still deserved it. You don't mess with another man's wife. If it were me, that guy wouldn't have walked out. Put him down right there." Now, Mike wasn't married, but I made a mental note that if he ever did tie the knot, his future wife better be on her best behavior. Diane Turner, the librarian, cleared her throat and shot Mike a pointed look. "That's not what happened, though," she said. "The judge explained the difference to us. It'd be one thing if Jeff walked in and caught them in the moment. That's heat of passion. But this," she shook her head. "Jeff planned this. He knew where they'd be. He brought the gun. Even if I believe the story about the modified bullets, that doesn't change the fact that he waited for them." Mr. Chavez shifted in his seat, nodding along. "I hear you," he said. "Truth is, I don't know what I'd do in his shoes. Nobody does until they're in that spot. But the fact he waited, planned it out, that's what makes it feel off." Mrs. Friedman, of course, couldn't resist another jab at Blake. "Did anyone else notice his suit?" she asked, shaking her head. "I don't mind spending money on nice clothes, but he looked like a walking disco ball. He could glow in the dark." "Too true," Diane chimed in. "I wouldn't trust that man to sell me life insurance, let alone defend me in court." Somehow, the conversation spiraled from Blake's wardrobe to Steve Bishop's fashion choices. The consensus? Steve dressed fine, but his combative attitude probably wouldn't have played well if Blake hadn't been his opponent. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a little sick to my stomach. How had we gone from attempted murder to critiquing ties and suits? I was beginning to wonder if this jury could focus on anything that actually mattered. Thankfully, Frank DeMaio stepped up when it counted. "All right," Frank said, his voice cutting through the chatter. Set all that other stuff aside. No matter how much we believe or don't believe Jeff's story, we know a few things for sure. Jeff knew David had been with his wife before, and he knew David planned to see her again. Jeff made a plan, surprised them, and shot him. There's no argument there. Frank glanced around the table, making sure everyone was with him. So, he continued, the real question is, what was Jeff trying to do by shooting him? Was he trying to kill him? Just scare him? What was the point? Mike scratched his chin, clearly unconvinced. None of this makes much sense to me, he admitted. I work construction, and there's a lot you've got to know for that. But this bullet stuff? You'd have to take a whole class just to learn how to do what he said. Seems to me he just got lucky with the misfire. Mrs. Friedman nodded in agreement. Exactly, she said. He didn't bring in any proof about those bullets. We're just supposed to take his word for it. I stayed quiet, but I was thinking the same thing. Jeff's story had holes, big ones. And while Blake's antics might have stolen the spotlight, the lack of hard evidence about those modified bullets was hard to ignore. Frank leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Maybe, he said, but lucky or not, that bullet didn't kill him. And we still have to figure out if Jeff meant for it to. I don't know about you guys, but I kind of think he meant to kill the guy, Mike said, cutting through the tension with his usual bluntness. I mean, if it were me, that'd be the plan. Laura shifted in her seat, tapping her pen against the table. Isn't there some kind of middle ground? She asked. They only gave us attempted murder. Why do you think that is, Robert? Frank glanced over at me, arms crossed. Yeah, why not something in between? Assault, maybe? I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Because they didn't want us to have a middle ground, I said. If they'd given us assault or aggravated battery, we'd probably lean toward that. But they figured we wouldn't go for attempted murder. This way, it's all or nothing. They gambled we'd give them all. Diane raised an eyebrow, her lips tightening. Look, I get it. The guy had it coming, she said plainly. But that doesn't mean you can just go around shooting people. If you walk in and catch them in the act, that's one thing. But planning it out, waiting for the right moment, that's different. Mr. Chavez nodded thoughtfully. Honestly, I'm not sure this bullet thing he keeps talking about is even real, he said. Feels like something he might have pulled out of a magazine. Maybe it's just a story he cooked up. Frank steered us back. Let's take a vote, he suggested, pulling out slips of paper and passing them around the table. One by one, we scribbled our verdicts and folded them up. Frank gathered them, unfolding each slip carefully. Guilty, he read, nodding slightly. Guilty, guilty. He kept going. 10 more times. Then he reached the last slip. His brow furrowed slightly as he unfolded it. Not guilty. A hush fell over the room. Frank cleared his throat. I know this is a secret vote and you don't have to explain. We can keep talking it out. But if the person who voted not guilty feels like sharing, we'd like to hear why. I glanced around the table, then raised my hand. Here we go, Mrs. Friedman muttered, arms crossed. Big shot lawyer. I ignored the jab. Look, does anyone here not think the main issue is whether Jeff really modified those bullets to make sure they couldn't hurt David? I asked, scanning the room. A few murmurs passed between them, but no one directly disagreed. Well, I continued, I think we already have proof that he's telling the truth about that. Justin, the bus driver, finally spoke up for the first time, eyebrows raised. What are you talking about, man? He asked. Nobody but Jeff even mentioned those bullets. Why should we believe him? I smiled. Exactly, I said. Nobody but him mentioned those bullets. Think about that for a second. I've been in courtrooms long enough to know the most important evidence isn't always what you hear, it's what you don't. If something's missing, there's usually a reason. And when you figure it out, it's like a light bulb goes off. I leaned forward. Do you remember what the firearms expert said about the bullets left in Jeff's gun? The room grew quiet. Laura furrowed her brow, thinking hard. He didn't say anything, she said finally. Exactly, I replied, snapping my fingers. That's the point. Now, I know most of you don't have legal training, but picture this: you're the prosecutor. You've got a firearms expert who examines the bullets left in the gun. Let's say one of them is unaltered. Hell, maybe none of them are modified. Wouldn't you have that expert testify to it? Of course, Sarah chimed in, leaning forward. Absolutely, Vince agreed. If there'd been even one regular bullet left in that gun, I pressed. Do you think they'd have told us? Yes, Mr. Cruz nodded. Definitely, Raymond added. No doubt, Terry agreed. I let the silence linger for a moment before I spoke again. So, is Steve Bishop stupid? I asked, looking around. No one answered. The fact is, I continued, if there had been a single regular bullet in that gun, we'd have heard about it. The expert would have testified to that right away. But he didn't, because they weren't there. Jeff made all those bullets the same way. And that, I said, glancing around the room, is why I voted not guilty. The room felt heavier as I watched them absorb what I'd said. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Natalie Granger sitting quietly in the courtroom, watching us through the glass window. She sat at the old bar, her hands clasped tightly around Jeff's. Despite everything, she looked concerned, worried. Even, maybe it was fear. Maybe it was loyalty. Either way, she had decided to stand by him. I wasn't sure if Jeff had manipulated her or if she was just committed to seeing things through. But their marriage, well, that was something none of us could fully understand. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze and leaned back, locking eyes with him for a moment. As we filed back toward the jury box, I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything we'd hashed out, I still had no idea what the others were thinking. I left that courtroom with a firm resolution. Going forward, I'd save my sarcasm for Thanksgiving dinners and family barbecues, where it might actually get a laugh. In court, I'd keep it buttoned up. No snarky comments directed at witnesses or opposing counsel, no matter how tempting it might be. I told myself, you'll treat everyone with as much respect as you can muster or fake, if it comes down to it. Frank must have sensed my inner dialogue. We'll hold you to that, he said with a grin. I smiled but kept the thought rolling in my head. I wouldn't call anyone a liar unless they'd tripped over their own story enough times to make it undeniable. If I had to challenge their words, I'd say their statement was inaccurate or misleading. Anything but a personal attack. Hate the sin, not the sinner, I reminded myself. Then the judge's voice pulled me back to reality. In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Jeff Granger on the charge of attempted murder, he said, his gaze sweeping over us, has the jury reached a verdict? I nodded, sitting up straighter as I prepared to speak. This part mattered. My goal was to sound calm and steady, like someone you could trust with important decisions, even if I wasn't quite sure I believed that about myself yet. We find the defendant not guilty, I said clearly. A quiet ripple passed through the courtroom, the kind of low murmur you get when people aren't sure if they're supposed to react. The judge gave a single nod, accepting the verdict without comment. At the defense table, Jeff Granger sat still for a moment, like he hadn't fully processed the words. Slowly, his eyes drifted toward Natalie, who hadn't let go of his hand since we walked in. Her knuckles were white from squeezing, and the mix of relief and disbelief on her face said more than words ever could. I caught the way she leaned in, whispering something close to his ear. Whatever it was made Jeff smile. Really smile, the kind that softened the hard lines of his face and reached his eyes. It was the first time I'd seen him look anything but bitter since the trial began. When the judge dismissed us, I gathered my things, filing out with the others. The hallway filled with low conversation, jurors quietly exchanging their thoughts. Some felt good about the verdict, certain it was the right call. Others still carried doubts, their brows furrowed as if second-guessing the entire process. But whatever we believed, we'd all heard the same testimony, weighed the same evidence, and arrived at the same decision. That had to count for something. As I stepped outside, the bright afternoon sun hit me like a reminder that life hadn't paused for the trial. The weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying started to lift. I didn't feel victorious, but I felt settled. It hadn't been an easy case. The facts were tangled, the emotions raw, and the people involved far from perfect. But we'd done our part. thought it through, argued it out, and reached the fairest conclusion we could. The jurors dispersed in small groups, exchanging quiet goodbyes. I lingered just long enough to catch Frank's eye as he made his way to the parking lot. We exchanged a nod, simple but enough to say, yeah, we did all right. There's a strange camaraderie that comes from sitting in a room for hours, debating someone else's fate. Frank and I might never cross paths again, but for those few days we'd been part of something bigger than either of us. As I walked to my car, my mind drifted ahead, toward home, my family, the errands I'd put off during the trial. But a part of me stayed behind, thinking about Jeff and Natalie. They'd walked out of that courtroom together, hand in hand, with whatever future lay ahead of them still unwritten. I wondered if this would be their second chance, their shot at getting things right. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. That wasn't for me to decide. The trial was over. The verdict was in. And as always, life moved on.